So, welcome to another edition of Fireside Chat. And I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by Maryn McKenna, who is a science writer that I got to know a few years ago. And she works at the Emory University Center for the Study of Human Health, where she's a senior fellow. And from there, she writes books and articles about all kinds of science topics. But the way that I got to know her was had to do with two books in particular that we'll talk about that were focused really on the problem of antimicrobial resistance. So, welcome, Maryn. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. Yeah, really, I've been looking forward to this interview for a while. I've been fascinated by what you do. So, tell us a little bit about your background. What's once upon a time you got a degree in, and how in the world did you become a science writer? How did all that kind of
I am a science writer because I failed at being a theater person.
happen?
So my undergraduate degree, this is a reliable laugh line for scientific audiences, so it's perfectly fine with me if people chortle. My undergraduate degree is in 16th century theater and 20th century poetry. And this actually turns out to have relevance for what I do now, but it took me a long time to realize that. So I got out of undergrad at Georgetown. I thought I wanted to work in theater. A good friend and I had a little theater company that moved around town, and it didn't take very long to figure out that we were both going to starve and we needed to actually have professions. So she went off to directing school, and I thought I wanted to be a writer since I had been an English major. And I went off to journalism school thinking it would be a relatively low cost, time limited investment. I would get a master's. I would go on, come back to writing about the arts in Washington, D.C. I went off to Northwestern and discovered that I actually really liked writing for newspapers, which was not in the plan. So, unfortunately, at the point at which I got out, there were no jobs available writing about the arts for newspapers. But what there were available were various kinds of investigative reporting jobs, because that was some training that I'd gotten in the 18 months or so of my master's. And so I took a job actually on the financial desk of a medium-sized paper in Illinois to do an investigation for them, actually about the collapse of savings and loans in the area. Was the, I guess, the beginning of the late 80s, early 90s savings and loan crisis.
Mhm.
So maybe this happens in science, but in journalism, at least, the way you used to climb the ladder of career was that you did a particular kind of story well in one place and you got asked to do a similar kind of story in another place. So I got asked to go from Illinois to Ohio to be part of a team that was looking into claims of a cancer cluster in far southwest Ohio among uh, rural residents with every kind of possible negative confounder for their health, who happened to live down the road from one of the plants that had built the weapons that ended World War II for the Manhattan Project. It was fairly early in the chain. It enriched uranium. It had been run incredibly badly, incredibly sloppily. And this group of people were convinced that their very aberrant cancers were linked to the misbehavior at this plant. And myself and the rest of the team dug up enough documents to help that group win a nuclear harm lawsuit against the US government. So that was both my first really notable investigation and also my introduction to epidemiology. Now, people who are watching this will probably know much better than I do that the epidemiology of cancer clusters in particular is really, really tricky. So I cannot say that we actually solved the issue, but what we did was create enough reasonable doubt because of the extremely sloppy behavior of the contractors who ran that plant to make a difference in people's lives. And that was both exciting journalistically and also kind of intellectually intoxicating. And so almost everything else I did in my career after that hinged in some way on epidemiology. A couple more newspaper jobs involving the first cases of Gulf War syndrome from the first Persian Gulf War, things having to do with emergency medicine, Massachusetts, where I later moved. And then I ended up in Atlanta, where I live again now. I've lived other places in between. Covering the CDC and for the newspaper here, and then subsequently becoming a magazine writer and book author and and quasi-academic, as you say.
Wow. And so you wound up living, as I understand it from one of the books, pretty close to CDC.
It is almost exactly 2 miles from my front door to the front door of 1600 Clifton. Not that you can actually get to the front door now because it's fenced off and walled off, and there are people with guns and magnetometers, and they'll sniff your car before you drive in. But yes, the CDC is quite close, and I live in a neighborhood full of Emory and CDC people, so it's an area that is highly attuned to the complexities of public health. And in the past year, had really good mask wearing compliance as a result.
I think so. Oh my goodness. Well, so let's actually turn then to some of your investigative journalism. And in particular, the theme I'd like you to draw out a little bit is the theme of communicating about antimicrobial resistance. The people who subscribe to this YouTube channel, read the newsletter, are aware of the efforts that we as a community have been putting into educating political leadership about the problem of AMR. And you've really got to get outside the techie, nerdy, geeky circle and influence the ministers of finance and influence people who don't really think AMR is part of what influences their life until, of course, COVID comes. So the theme that I'm really interested in is lessons you've learned about storytelling. And I don't mean this to be a shameless plug for you, but I'm going to hold up 2 of your books. So Big Chicken was the first one I became aware of personally. And I think I learned about this one. You and I bumped into each other, met at, I think, one of the Boston area meetings, and that's kind of, we communicated a little bit. And then I learned about Big Chicken. And then the other one is an earlier book that you wrote about MRSA. And both of these, now that I know that you're an investigative journalist, now they make perfect sense. I mean, they all have these stories that actually sort of flow through all of them. So I'm going to actually point you at Big Chicken and Stuart Levy, the page I've marked. Much beloved infectious diseases physician. And I did not know the story of Stuart Levy and his hard to describe poop study.
His experimental chicken farm
His
on the outskirts of
experimental
Boston.
chicken
Yes, exactly.
Talk to me a little bit about how you got into that story, and then what did you learn from writing this book about how to tell this story? Because this chicken thing is really hard. People, changing the way we do farming is really hard.
So I love that you pulled up that particular story because I owe a tremendous amount to Dr. Levy. He was very, very kind to me, and he is responsible for the way that this issue is framed in the United States. And if it had not been for his going out way in advance of what the public and particularly politicians were really ready to hear back in 1976. We didn't get in 1977 what the policy change that he and the Carter administration wanted. We didn't get it until 40 years later in the last days of the Obama administration. But the issue of antimicrobial use in agriculture was on the US agenda at all, was due to his persistence over decades. First in doing that kind of, as you say, sort of outlaw study involving creating an experimental chicken farm of sorts on a property outside Boston, recruiting a family to run it for him, recruiting the family to donate their poop to prove what was going on, and the neighbors to prove the traffic of what we would now call plasmids, but what at the time people would have called R factors. But through the farm environment and from animals to animals, through the environment to people, without his really, I think, path-breaking work, we would not understand that issue the way we do now. And it was because of his work, I think, that even though Europe, not yet the European Union, but Western Europe, was aware of the issue of antimicrobial use in agriculture early, primarily actually as a result of work done in the UK in 1969 with the publication of the Swan Report. The UK was way out in front of the rest of Western Europe. And it wasn't until after Levy's research was published that the Scandinavian countries and then the rest of what's now the European Union really moved to make a change about antimicrobials in agriculture. And I think Dr. Levy could claim that as part of his intellectual legacy, even though it took us a long time to follow them. So you asked me how I figured out how to tell that story.
And also a little bit about telling the story, and then also why did it take another 40 years? I mean, what insights would you have for us about how to move things along more rapidly? We've made some progress with talking about pull incentives and other sorts of things, but we're not there yet, and I don't want it to take another 40 years.
So I can answer the second question faster. The reason why it took 40 years was because of politics and because of political opposition backed by powerful commercial interests. The person who kept Dr. Levy's research from being encoded in policy and who threatened to wreck the entire reform agenda of the then brand new Jimmy Carter administration and his new FDA commissioner, Donald Kennedy, was a single congressman from Mississippi, Jamie Whitten, who unfortunately for this question turned out to be the longest ever serving member of the House of Representatives. He did not retire until the 1990s, but he was so opposed philosophically or because of his donors, backers, to moving ahead with the political change that the Carter administration wanted to make to remove growth promoter antibiotics from agriculture, that he threatened first to wreck the entire budget of the FDA via the Appropriations Committee. And second, when he got his way, he ensured in a rider he wrote on the appropriations bill and renewed every 2 years, that no federal money could be used to investigate this question. So over the decades, the then Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Medical Association, various journals, various private, independent researchers, all moved ahead in exploring this question, but political change wasn't possible until first he retired, and then an administration, the Obama administration, came in and was willing to open the question again. So first, money talks. Second, sometimes there are immovable obstacles. And third, there are sometimes ways around those immovable obstacles if you're creative enough. And what the Obama administration did was to find a way to control the use of growth promoters that didn't require legislation. Right. They made it a regulatory change, and that way Congress could not interfere.
Right, the voluntary feed initiatives. And that actually aligned, the timing of that would have aligned with sort of 2012. 2012 was the year that the WHO really started pushing for national action plans, and that was, so the PCAST report was in Presidential Commission Council on Science and Technology did their report in 2013, which led to the National Action Plan in 2014. And I remember learning about the work you're describing kind of around 2014, 2015, I believe is when that was coming together. Interesting. In terms of moving large groups to understand an issue like this, was there, in the 70s, how long did it take the IOM, the AMA, to get behind this sort of thing? And what did you have to, what sorts of things did Stuart Levy learn along the way? You're talking to him about how you get inside the head of a larger and larger group of people.
So my observation as a science writer is that there is almost always going to be a small audience for whom the intricacy of your subject is enough. Who will just geek out on whether it's plasmids or agricultural policy or the intricacies of stewardship or whatever the core issue is as it exists on the policy page. There will be a group of people who care about it in that form. That's almost never enough people to actually move either policy or personal change forward. So what you need is to find a way to enrobe that desired policy change in some form of storytelling. This is the point where I geek out. So it is my observation, as someone who's been telling stories for a shockingly long time now, that so many of the stories that we tell each other, not just in our culture in the Anglophone West, but across cultures, really have at their core the same basic plots or shapes. And when I am trying to tell stories that aim to make a policy point, I reach for one of those plots or shapes because they have an almost autonomic response on us. We recognize that we have heard this form of story before and we want to hear it again. So what are those shapes? So there are things like, I'll tell you the fictional versions first and then talk about how they could be nonfiction, which is really what we're talking about. So, a disadvantaged child finds out they have more power than they ever expected. A man goes on a journey and confronts an unexpected obstacle that changes his fortunes. Boy meets girl, girl meets girl, boy meets boy, some form of romance. Those are, so a man goes on a journey is Noah and Edmund Hillary climbing Everest and The Hobbit, possibly also The Lord of the Rings. A child finds he or she has more power than they expected is Oliver Twist and Mulan and Star Wars.
Yeah.
So all of these stories have some predictable arc. There's actually a lovely YouTube video somewhere where Kurt Vonnegut describes the content of his not accepted master's thesis at the University of Chicago, in which he actually draws out the shapes of stories as arcs, and it's really delightful to watch. There's about 6 different edits of it on YouTube, and dependent on length and sound quality. So the story that I go back to the most is the detective story. I mean, there is a reason why we call epidemiologists, field epidemiologists, disease detectives, is that they are fundamentally doing the same, they're performing the same actions that we have been obsessed with as a culture since probably the first story of a genius detective, which actually might be Edgar Allan Poe, but it probably predates Poe. There may be a French detective story that's earlier than that, in about the 1820s. But the one that has the crazy power over us in the Anglophone world, of course, is Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And there has not been a year since Arthur Conan Doyle first wrote the first Sherlock Holmes story that there has not been some Sherlock Holmes story or iteration or homage running or being published somewhere. I mean, at the moment, there are probably half a dozen Sherlock Holmes pastiches in movies or streaming or on TV or in books. And so there is something particularly intoxicating about the detective story. First, because there's a strong personality, and I'll come back to that. And that strong personality serves as a kind of focusing mechanism for the audience, almost like zooming in with a camera. We know what happened. In most detective stories, we know that a jewel has been stolen or someone's been murdered, but we don't know why. And it's the intellectual intoxication of figuring out the why that gives a detective story its power. So in my first book, which you did not mention, but I will flash it here, Beating Back the Devil, which is the history of the CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Service. 50% of it is the account of a year I spent embedded with them, and the other 50% is the history of the 50 years that preceded that year, which was 1951 to 2001, to the anthrax attacks. And my year, 2002 to 2003, was the year of SARS. I got very fortunate. But all of the chapters are essentially detective stories with one strong character that serves as the focusing mechanism, and in some ways kind of the person through whom the audience, viewer, reader can experience the emotional burden of what is going on.
Yeah.
And the larger lesson of this, and this is true really for any form of storytelling, and I think it's the big challenge for AMR, is that for the most part, we don't listen to stories because of a policy point. We listen to stories because of an individual. The best stories, the stories that are in a psychological sense stickiest about any disease process are N of 1. And this drives epidemiologists crazy because N of 1 is not supposed to be significant, right? But to find a single suffering or triumphing person in the core of a story and make them your lens for the audience to experience the issue is an infallible storytelling technique.
Mm-hmm. And you do that. I was just, as you're talking about this, I'm realizing, yes, of course, that's what you're doing in this book. I mean, many of these chapters start off with, you know,
a person doing a thing, or a thing being done to a person, right?
Yeah, the first alert, the story about Tony Love's knee that aches at the very beginning of Superbugs, and you know, then we come along and we meet Daum et al., who are ultimately going to figure it out. I mean, interesting to turn it around and make it into a detective story, huh?
So there are some people and groups within the AMR space that have, whether have phrased it to themselves the way I just phrased it, they have sensed the power of this focusing on the individual. The Infectious Diseases Society of America, for probably 10 years now, has been putting on their website individual stories of people who were killed by or gravely suffered from a resistant infection. So, but what they also do is they have, and this might be Pew as opposed to IDSA, they used to have a thing called Super Moms Against Superbugs, in which they would actually take the mothers of victims of resistant infections, many of whom did not survive, to Capitol Hill for lobbying days to be able to look congressmen in the eye and say, this is what AMR does to a person, to a family. Help us fix this so it won't happen again the way it happened to my child. Within the book Superbug, there's the story of Everly Macario, who was a supermom against superbugs. She's a faculty member at the University of Chicago, or was at the time. She and her husband lost their son Simon to MRSA, to a resistant infection, and she was a suffering mother before she was a lobbyist. But what is the story is tragic, but it is at the same time, in a sort of meta sense, and almost classically perfect tale of what you would want in order to touch someone's heart enough to make them want to make an intellectual change.
So when I think about the challenge the AMR community faces right now, we've got people understanding the area a bit. The thing that is currently just the great challenge is pulling together the political willpower to create a strong, clear pull incentive that's big enough to equalize the economics. And there's been the Pasteur Act has been kind of wiggling its way through the Congress. Are you familiar with Pasteur? Is that ringing a bell? And it's about to get reintroduced. It's my understanding is that soon it will be in 117th Congress with a real intent to pass it. And it's interesting that it's gotten that much attention, but we're also seeing critiques of the general principle itself that we're going to have to deal with, and probably the most recurring critique is, are we going to be paying for a drug that isn't all that interesting? The idea of Pasteur is that when we get a new drug approved, if it's good enough quality, the U.S. government will pay between $750 million and $3 billion over 10 years for that drug to be available in the marketplace. And the UK is doing a small version of that. The UK is doing a UK-sized version of that with 2 drugs right now. And the idea of Pasteur is that it would be enough money to do it for potentially 3 or 4 drugs over the next 10 years, kind of well-chosen drugs. And on the one hand, you could say, great, I'd like to have new drugs, but you can also say, but are all the new drugs equally valuable? And there you have to say that's absolutely the case that some fire extinguishers, if you will, are more interesting than others. Sort of new fire extinguishers. I've got enough fire extinguishers for wood fires. What I want is a fire extinguisher for something else. And so this critique about we've got to be sure that the things that we reward are actually things that everybody goes, yeah, I'd really like to have one of those. I won't be embarrassed about having done it. And I'm looking for ways to kind of connect the theme of we can do that, which is you can specify what you want in the new drug, you can specify one novelty. And the UK government, by the way, did that in their RFP. They actually laid out a point scoring system that says you get number of points for this and that and the other thing. And that's how they picked the 2 drugs they decided to purchase, was they had good point scores. And Pasteur doesn't lay out the points specifically, but it lays out the principle that you have a committee that'll get together and set out some targets that would be rewardable under this scheme. But still, $750 million to $3 billion is a lot of money to give a pharmaceutical company. It's a lot of money to give a pharmaceutical company. And yet we do it for other drugs. We just don't do it in kind of an organized societal way. With other drugs, you and I pay for them. If you need the new cancer drug, if you need the new diabetes drug, you pay for it. Here we're looking at buying it for society as a whole. And Lord O'Neill in the AMR review would say that $1 billion is not a lot relative to protecting the entire economy. So if you think about that kind of confluence of influencing people who are concerned about the pharmaceutical industry, they're suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry. How do you work with that in terms of storytelling?
It's hard. This is a really hard problem. I've been thinking about this for a couple of years now, because not just because these pieces of legislation have been out. I'm not sure how long, when disarm was first introduced. Was it 2017? It's hard because it's wonky. And it's hard because, and you slid by this a little bit, but I think this is the central point for the average audience member, is that these are all proposals to give pharma companies money. And Martin Shkreli has a lot to answer for, because he's like he was the perfect villain for pharmaceutical pricing, right? So saying we need to save pharmaceutical companies so they can make novel compounds, and we need to do it by giving them boatloads of dosh, is just not a very successful strategy right now. I think we can see that, right? Is it because it takes a lot of education to get the average audience member to be able to distinguish between a hypothetical future antibiotic that will save their life and the very expensive cancer drug that might give their loved one another 4 to 6 weeks of life, or their life-saving insulin that just went up some incredible thousands of percent. I don't actually know what the price rise has been, but it's massive, right? There are so many things that the pharmaceutical industry has to answer for in terms of pricing, that it's a really tough storytelling challenge to carve out antimicrobials from that and figure out a way to tell that story. And I have been struggling this because I've written several stories over the past for various outlets, for Nature and the Boston Globe and Mother Jones and some other places, about the puzzle of how to ensure the financial health of companies that will make novel compounds in the future. So there's a couple of things that I have come up with as strategies. I don't think they're perfect strategies, but they're what I've evolved so far. So going back to that sort of focus on the single individual, you can find a patient who actually was saved by a compound that that made it through this Scylla and Charybdis of pharmaceutical pricing. They're hard to find, but not impossible. Someone who's grateful for that drug not having vanished from the market. So that there's an actual suffering person to be your lens. You can imagine a future person. So let's take Paratech, for instance, because they were saved by what was effectively a pull incentive from BARDA they got that BARDA contract for 5 years of Nuzyra on the assumption that it would have a biodefense
Right.
use. So maybe if I already have written a story about Paratech, but it didn't have this in it. What if you're hypothetical? What if you imagine someone who was like, an army infantryman who gets a lung full of weaponized anthrax somewhere, and that drug exists because of that and is available to save that soldier's life because of that pull incentive. Maybe that's a possibility. And the third is I talked about how one of those universal story shapes is sort of the person going up against the enormous challenge, and sometimes that story doesn't end well. Sometimes the person goes up against the enormous challenge and dies, and we still think that's very heroic. Right? There was a Robert Redford movie a few years ago of a guy single-handedly sailing around the world, and I don't think that movie ends well. It's called All Is Lost. But we still recognize poetry and drama and tragedy in people going up against something and failing. So maybe in the stories of the companies that have gone down to defeat in the past couple of years, or put themselves up for auction, Achaeogen, Melinta, Antibiotics, most recently, maybe there's a tragic tale to be told in those, that if the rescue, that the cavalry doesn't come in this story, right? The rescue doesn't arrive. And the storytelling twist is in the last third is, well, we could create the cavalry, right? The cavalry would be, I realized that as I'm saying this, that there are all kinds of colonialist implications to cavalry. And so excuse me for bringing that up, but that is a recognized story form of the mid 20th century, right? Of the sort of John Ford Westerns, is the cavalry comes over the ridge and saves the sailors. So maybe there's I haven't tried most of these strategies of sort of spinning them out in real time here, but there are things that might be worth trying to get people over the hump of, but this all comes back to money for a pharma company.
Yeah. Well, and we've certainly gotten some good, you mentioned Achaeogen in particular, we've definitely gotten some good mileage out of that story, because we're able to say how much money had gone in to Achaeogen. And you can really articulate the very specific costs that the company faced that made them go out of business. We actually had some folks from who had been there do a session at one of the meetings, an ASM Escomend meeting in Boston a couple of years ago, where they worked through the math in really quite clear detail and said, this is the first time that I realized that if I hand you a newly approved antibiotic, here's the newly approved antibiotic, and here's the factory that makes it, and the people that make it are already hired, it's all staffed up, the car's in the driveway, here are the keys, have a nice life. Your net present value right now is negative $350 million, because you need $350 million to break even over the next 10 years, not to get ahead. You're going to need $25 million a year to run the plant and $100 million for post-approval stuff. And until you earn $350 million worth of sales, you're still in the hole. And since most new antibiotics are selling $20 to $40 million a year, you pretty quickly figure out that, well, this is not exactly a long-term strategy. It's kind of like your story when you figured out that you needed a better way to earn money as a young person. You moved into something else. Fascinating.
So another kind of a story form we didn't talk about this, but one of the places I write for the most these days is Wired magazine, where I'm a contributor on sort of about the COVID pandemic. And a story form that's used to be very common to Wired and was very common to the tech and scientific press, certainly up until about 2000, is kind of the sort of the garage tinkerer, the contrarian single scientist who presses on against all odds while everybody else tells him or her that they are um,
Frank Talley.
yes, right. So maybe that's another story form that could be applied to antimicrobial research. I don't know. I haven't really thought through that fully, but it's a possibility.
So let me try you with another one. It's another storytelling one that we debate a lot. And that's this business about superiority data versus non-inferiority trials for the approval of antibiotics. I want a new drug. I want a better drug. I don't want some non-inferior drug. I want a better drug. And you dig into the problem of superiority and you discover that, well, it's actually, yeah, it's nice in theory, but you don't actually want to be the person who's in the trial that's seeking superiority of the new agent. And I end up spending hours talking to people about that one, trying to come up with a way to articulate the fundamental tension that arises. Say, yes, I appreciate that that's what you might like. It's a placebo-controlled study of a new antibiotic. But have you ever really thought about what that means to you? And the whole COVID thing, in a way, has been a bit of an experience with that. The instant there was anything, experimental monoclonal antibodies, anything, the desire to use it just blows everything out of the way in terms of being able to do an organized trial. Is that one that you've spent any time musing on? Do you have any sort of?
I have not done any stories that hinge on that particular calculation, and it's an interesting puzzle to think what would I do. I think again, so there's going to be a core audience who is going to understand that if you tell it in the language you just used to me, right? But that the challenge is that core audience is not large enough to amplify sort of cultural understanding of the inherent problem. So you need to find another way to tell that story for the larger audience you want to reach. What is a different frame that can be put around it? This is all very hypothetical and blue sky, but I think if I were asked by an editor to try that, I would go again for sort of like the single person as the lens through which to experience it, and I'd look for a trial participant, or hypothesize a trial participant. So I think we have seen a version of this story emerge over the past year. There's been a lot of coverage of people deciding whether to enter vaccine trials or not, and then processing their uncertainty as they don't know whether they actually received the compound or a placebo. And there actually is a great story that was published recently by Maryn McKenna in Science. He's a staff writer at Science. He was a participant in a COVID vaccine trial in Europe. He was randomized, and he's decided to drop out and go for a proven vaccine. Now, you didn't actually ask me about how do you tell the story of placebo-controlled trials. You're asking a more sophisticated question than that. But I think in the amount of storytelling that there's been around the vaccine trials, around participants in the vaccine trials over the past year or so, I think there are some lessons to be extracted about how do you focus the attention of the audience long enough to explain the scientific or policy implications. It all comes down to the same thing, right? It all comes down to having something. Most people, my observation as a practitioner, the mass audience for the most part doesn't read. They either don't read for technical information or they don't read only for technical information. For some people, there is the glorious intellectual challenge of actually learning something technically new to them. But most people read for some combination of intellectual enchantment and emotional identification. And the challenge for so many stories around AMR is the emotional identification. How do we find something to engage the reader or viewer's emotion in such a way that they stick with us through the more technical didactic parts?
Okay. I'll just take that away and chew on it. Maybe you'll have some brilliant insight and drop me a note and we'll figure out how to do something with that idea. Those are the payer problem and the superiority and non-inferiority problem are the two things that just come up just regularly. And we are looking for better ways to tell stories. So I, we're going to need to draw this to a close here in a minute. But before we go, what are you working on now? What's going to be the next fun thing we're going to hear from you?
So we are not supposed to talk about things that that have not published yet. So I'll tell you about something that just was published because I'm very pleased with it. I wrote the cover story of the current Scientific American. So we are speaking on the 1st of June. So in the June issue of Scientific American, it's called The Next Deadly Plague. And it's about the underappreciated threat of invasive fungal infections and the lack, which you will certainly understand better than I do, of adequate antifungal drugs. And that story has been, or versions of that story has been sort of like washing around in my brain for about 5 years. And
Wow.
it just like never really let me go. Probably since, it's almost exactly 5 years actually, since Tom Chiller of the CDC first told me about this bizarrely behaving yeast called Candida auris and how he was concerned about it, even though it wasn't in the United States yet, and the CDC is a US government institution, because colleagues were reporting it from Europe and it was behaving really badly. So I wrote a couple of stories about Candida auris. I sort of developed a strand of my practice that was about fungal infections. I wrote a thing about azole-resistant aspergillus for The Atlantic and about expanding coffee leaf rust, Himalaya vastatrix for The Atlantic. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go for the big story. And so this 6,000 word cover piece in Scientific American is about a whole array of terrible fungi and how fascinating they are. And somewhat to my delight and surprise, the audience has really picked up on this. Scientific American says that the metrics, that the traffic on this story has been really, really good. So people were not turned off by it being the next deadly plague. They were actually sort of enchanted by the idea of a different disease or category of disease organisms that we should be on the lookout for.
Fun to have something that extends beyond bacteria, and it's not a virus. It's a little bit different. Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Well, let me just then say thank you. I think that I've long felt like people who would take the time to turn a story, a science story, into something that other people could get at, were really as big a part of this whole endeavor as anybody else, because the techie geeky people, me. We're just, that's not what we do naturally. And I love knowing that actually deep down you are a theater person who wanted to write plays and novels, I guess, and has turned that into a way of seeing investigative journalism that really lights people up. And just fabulous.
It taught me much more than I realized at the time about all the storytelling skills I use now. How to give backstory in a compressed fashion, how to literally get characters on and off stage, except it's the stage of the narrative and not the physical stage. It was more useful than I knew. There was a long time as a science writer when I thought, why did I get that undergraduate degree in 16th century theater and 20th century poetry? Surely that was a waste of my time and dollars. And now I have come around to thinking, no, actually, it was the right thing to do.
It was really time well spent. It is fun to see how sometimes the circle closes in unsurprising ways. Well, I'll just say, thanks. This has been fun. I have been looking to get to chat with you, and fingers crossed that we can actually do something face to face sometime in the next year. I would hope to run into you at one of the various antimicrobial jamborees when you're doing your next bit of investigative journalism.
I would like that very much. And thanks for asking me today.
what a delight to get to visit with Maryn. Her writing is a lot of fun, and I encourage you, if this was interesting, to find a copy of Superbugs or Big Chicken, and enjoy the way she tells the stories. And also, as I read the books, it was actually fun because I kept seeing names of people that I had heard of, or in some cases knew, and it was really like kind of visiting through the whole history of infectious diseases over the last several decades to read those books. So really highly recommended to check those books out. And if you enjoyed this video in general, please, as always, like, comment, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.